Normally what I do when I give this presentation is I talk a little bit about the drought planning process, what that means, what parts of it, the components of it, and give some case studies of what people have done, because everybody does it a little bit differently. But fortunately today, I think some of the case studies are in the room. And they're going to be presenting a little bit later from Colorado, maybe Arizona, New Mexico. So I'd really like to hear about their drought planning in person. So just to get everybody started here, when I think of drought planning, it's really about trying to understand your issues, your problems associated with drought, so that you can implement drought mitigation or adaptation measures and response measures to reduce the likelihood of experiencing those types of impacts in the future. And there's a couple ways people go about it. One is sometimes people develop a drought response plan. So that's the plan of who is going to do what during a drought event. Others might work on a mitigation plan of things you can do in advance of drought to increase your resilience, so the next time a drought comes along, you're less likely to be impacted, and the less likely you are to need to implement response actions. And then some people do both. So their drought plan might be a drought mitigation and response plan. Again, it outlines what the state should be doing, or a local entity or a city or whoever should be doing before drought, and who is going to do what during drought. It incorporates both of those things. And this next slide kind of shows you the trends in planning at the state level over the last 25 years. For example, in 1982, there were only 3 states that had plans. And you can see that down below, the states in the green there, Colorado, South Dakota, New York. But then by 1990, 24 states had plans. But again, all of these plans were drought response plans. What should people in the state be doing during a drought event? Now in the mid-90s, risk management, it kind of followed other hazards. Risk management and other hazards was pretty common. In drought, that's when people began to focus on it. That's it in terms of mitigation, what you should be doing before drought, not just responding to it. And so Montana had the first state mitigation plan. And by 2006, though, 10 states with mitigation plans. And now, by last year, 47, almost every state has a state drought plan. 13 of those are mitigation and response plans, and the rest would be response plans. So the trend is usually if people develop a new plan or they update one, they usually try to incorporate a mitigation plan. You can see all the orange ones up in, there's no pointer here, but up in the top right corner, the orange ones would be the mitigation plans. The blue or purple would be in development or defer to local planning. But generally the trend is people try to incorporate mitigation when they can, and the newer plans, because they were pretty much response plans, but that's not always the case. For example, South Dakota just updated their state mitigation plan. They didn't update the drought response plan. Oklahoma right now is going through a process of updating their state response plan, and they might not get to the mitigation. So it depends on what your priorities are and what you think you can get done. But those are the trends right now. Now, people go about it all different ways, because a lot of times this planning takes place in different contexts. For example, they may have a legislation or agency mandate to conduct planning, or it could be a stakeholder-driven, more grassroots approach. For example, in Nebraska, our governor a couple decades ago just said, you will develop a plan, the state agencies will get together, I want a plan before I leave office, and it will be done quickly. And so they had a few months to produce something. And so they did it. In other cases like Hawaii, the stakeholder agencies just came together through in-kind contributions, no external funding, and they just put a plan together. They thought it was necessary. So the same thing, substantial political support and funding, or just in-kind support. You see both. When I think of the strong political support and funding, I might think of Colorado. I think they put a lot of resources into their planning, and they have a lot of support for that. Other states might be more of a shoestring budget, somewhat like ours, and more in-kind support. And the plans can be very broad, covering a lot of different sectors. I'd say a couple decades ago, a lot of times if you saw a plan, it might focus on ag and water, maybe fire involved in there. Now, people usually also include maybe recreation, health, energy, water quality. They're usually encompassing plans. Doesn't have to be, but usually what a state or a local entity will do is say, what are the primary effects of drought for our particular place? And then they'll say, okay, if it's energy, recreation, ag, whatever, those will be the sectors we're going to cover in our plan. So some just have more sectors to cover than others. And again, I mentioned you might have a short time frame or a multi-year effort. I've seen plans put together in a few months, or I've seen people take a year or 2 years, maybe a year to update it, 2 years to develop a new plan. So it can be very time consuming, or it can be done quickly, depending on your needs. But no matter how you do it, we say there's a few things you should try to incorporate into your planning process and your resulting plan. So we call these the 3 pillars. 1 would be some type of a vulnerability assessment. 2, a drought early warning system. And 3, mitigation and/or response actions. And so for the vulnerability assessment, really focuses on who and what is at risk and why. What's your threats that you're trying to address? How does drought affect you? What are you concerned about? And why do those impacts occur? And with that information, you can start to determine what should we be monitoring to track this threat, and what are some actions that we can take before and during drought to reduce the likelihood of experiencing those impacts in the future. And I'll go into each one of these in a little more detail. But first, I just wanted to say here that we think you should carry out these activities. Somebody needs to promote the process, lead the process, organize these efforts. Usually at the state level, it's through some type of a task force. In this case, up at the top, you'll see there's a drought task force. There might be a monitoring committee. So the drought task force would be maybe the agency heads, the primary decision makers at the kind of a cabinet level. The monitoring committee would be the ones who track the threat of drought. That might be your hydrologists, your climatologists. Then the risk assessment committee, or sometimes people call those impact assessment committees, vulnerability assessment committees. Those committees are usually the people brought together to try to investigate the threat of drought. What are we concerned about with drought as an issue, and possibly start to develop some ideas for addressing those impacts. And then they report those up to the task force, and the task force usually makes the final decisions. There could be an advisory committee on the side. Sometimes these might be stakeholders. Sometimes they might be feds in an advisory group. They might not be directly on their task force, but they could be advisors in the process. So now I have this little organizational structure diagram here, but that's not necessarily how it looks in practice. Now I know Utah has an organizational structure as well. I didn't present that one because I think somebody's going to talk about that in a bit. But this is an example from Hawaii. And in that case, they have the governor's office is at the top. Instead of calling it a task force, they call it the Hawaii Drought Council. They have a state drought coordinator under the council. That's a full-time position, someone who just keeps activities going. Even when you're not in a drought, they're the ones who keeps the communication going, keeps people on task, answers questions, serves as a point of contact. It's a full-time position. And then their Water Resources Committee would be their monitoring committee. And instead of having a risk assessment committee or an impact committee necessarily, well, they do, but it's at the island level. Each island is a committee. And so those are their impact assessment committees. They have a group of people, decision makers on each island that will assess their risk, understand what types of impacts, monitor their impacts, and come up with strategies. They will pass that up to the state drought coordinator. They will pass it up to the council for consideration, and communication will go 2 ways there. So the point again is that the organizational structure looks different state by state. Now the tasks to carry out. We said the first pillar was some type of a vulnerability assessment. Now risk, this is kind of a classic conceptual equation of risk. And there's several others, so we try not to get too hung up on the terminology, as long as you understand the process that you're trying to achieve. And so your risk is determined by a combination of the occurrence of a hazard and some type of vulnerability or susceptibility to that hazard. If you don't have the hazard, there's no risk. If there's no vulnerability, there's no risk. You have to have one or the other, or a combination of those. And there's not really a lot you can do about the hazard of drought. I mean, the lack of precipitation. There's not too many things you can do about that, but there is a lot you can do to reduce your vulnerability to that lack of precipitation. So there tends to be a lot of emphasis placed on vulnerability assessment. So that you need to understand the problems so you can develop informed decisions on how to manage that problem. And generally what this would consist of, there's a lot of different ways to do it, but you would, one, want to try to understand the occurrence of drought. What were some past drought years? Are there trends in drought? Do we have any information about the future conditions of drought? Just to understand your hazards. And then what types of impacts occurred during those drought events. In the past, you could model the future, you could come up with some scenarios, but what are the impacts associated with past, current, and future droughts? And why do those impacts occur? Some people just report a list of impacts, but it doesn't really tell you much about why those impacts occur and why they're occurring in certain places. For example, you could have some counties in the western part of the state that run out of water, some communities that run out of water every time there's a drought. Well, it doesn't really give you much good to know that they just run out of drought. You want to know why. And so is it because they have shallow aquifers, they don't have a lot of storage, they don't have backup pumps? What are the issues? So that's really what a vulnerability assessment does, is start asking questions about why these impacts occur. And then there's some type of assessment of your management capabilities. So you understand the occurrence of drought, the impacts associated with drought, something about why those impacts occur, and the last one, the capacity, would be, what's your current capacity for dealing with these types of impacts? Do you have policies and programs and funding in place to deal with these impacts when they occur, or not? And all of those things rolled together would be your vulnerability assessment. And as I mentioned, there's lots of different ways to do this. People take a lot of different approaches, again, based on how much money, time, expertise you have, willingness to do it. But at the top, it could be anything from a literature review, looking at news stories of past droughts and the impacts associated with those, focus groups, meetings, interviews, doing studies, asking farmers and ranchers, municipal water suppliers, how are they affected by drought. It could look at future scenarios. Quantitative indicators, you could try to calculate drought losses, economic losses, map those losses, or systems modeling, try to model an entire system so you know how it may be, if you change the parameters, you may be able to see how they're affected by drought. So, and I would say in the past, most of the assessments that I saw were more of at the top of the list. Brainstorming, literature reviews, interviews, discussions, meetings. They're mainly qualitative, to be quite a few years ago. And now more and more, I'd say they're coming down on the list. As more data is available, people are trying to quantify things, map impacts and vulnerable sectors. So, like I said, they probably cost a little bit more as you come down the list, but people are they have this data and they're trying to use it more and more. Trying to get more of a quantitative assessment of drought impacts and vulnerability. But whatever approach you choose, you just have to make sure you're going to achieve your goal of what you want is a good understanding of drought occurrence and vulnerability so that you can implement effective, informed, and sound risk management strategies. You want to understand the problem so you can figure out what to do about it. And so I always tell people, you just have to be able to tell your story of drought, past, present, and future, to inform future action. So so you understand the problem and the capacity you have to do about it. So another pillar is you have to be able to track drought conditions so that you know when you should do something about it. And so there's a lot of different things that you could monitor. You have all this understanding about the issues, and you could understand that you could monitor the climate, the water, the soils, impacts. This is on the right-hand side here is a diagram from our center, and it just shows how drought propagates its way through the environment. And it's a little bit probably small to see there. But at the top, you've got climate variability. So you have reduced precipitation. You have a lack of rainfall, which can result in reduced infiltration, reduced runoff, reduced groundwater recharge. Sometimes in association with high temperature, you could get evaporation. All this leads to soil water deficiencies. which could cause plant losses, low stream flows, low groundwater levels, and that trickles down into impacts on the environment and people. And so you could monitor a lot of different things here. You could monitor rainfall, you could monitor runoff, groundwater recharge, soil water, evaporation, plant water stress, stream flows, impacts. You just have to decide through conversation what are the primary impacts to monitor our threat and what is feasible to do on an ongoing basis. And you could monitor one thing. I see in the Utah State Drought Plan, there's a surface water supply index. It says that it's the primary one. Not that you don't look at other ones, but it says there's one. Maybe you could do multiple indices or indicators, or roll those together into more of a composite like our U.S. Drought Monitor, which I think somebody's going to talk about that maybe this morning next. We'll see if they're here. And then you can use that monitoring to trigger actions during drought. So you need a system in place to track drought conditions so that as conditions become more severe, you can implement actions in a timely manner, usually through some types of phases. You might have a normal phase, advisory, alert, warning, emergency. Like I said, you could use one trigger. You could use multiple triggers. You just have to determine which of that system you want to monitor on an ongoing basis. And then you have to be able to communicate this information to decision makers. And a lot of times people will put a system together, a monitoring system together. They test it when a drought comes through, see how well it worked, and they're always changing it as they go along. But you have to be able to get that information out to people. I say it's not an early warning system if you don't actually warn anyone about it and get that information to them. So far you understand the problem, you understand how to monitor, now you have to figure out what to do about it. So people usually come up with a long list of options for mitigating drought or for responding to it. And there's a lot of different ways or ways to do that. People usually have meetings. They might commission some studies. They look at past studies that have been done. We've got a new database, well, relatively new, at our center, the NDNC Drought Management Database. That what it is a collection of stories from around the country of people who have been trying to respond to drought, and it lists a lot of different mitigation response actions there. It has stories about them, just to see what other people are doing. But a lot of times you come up with this big, huge list of actions that could be done, but you really have to prioritize them to see what is feasible, what can we feasibly do about drought. And so people usually develop some type of a list of questions to help filter out some of these actions. Do they address priority impacts and vulnerabilities? Do they have effective cost-benefit ratios or positive? Is there a public demand to address certain impacts? Are they sensitive to the environment? Are they fair to local sectors? Maybe there's some group that's more vulnerable than others that needs some attention, that doesn't have the capacity to implement actions for themselves. So you have to be able to list actions, prioritize them, filter them, and then link them to understand when you're going to implement them. Some of these things could be done before drought, some could be done in the early stages of drought, and some are more emergency response actions. Something you might come up with a matrix, something like Colorado's drought plan, where on the left-hand side you've got your indicators you're monitoring. When these indicators reach a certain severity level, they trigger a different phase in the middle, and you might have your actions you're going to take on the right-hand side. And then all you have to do is put all of this together into a plan. I mean, which can be, I don't want to underestimate how much time that can take. It's quite a process. And then there's the review process. And the only one thing I wanted to note on here too is this testing of the plan. That is something we always put on all of our planning guides at the end. You need to test your plan. Climate, environment, and society, they're all dynamic processes. And so, you want to make this a living document. You don't want to make all this work into a document to put on a shelf that nobody reads until there's the next drought and somebody dusts it off and takes a look at it. It's a living document that should be updated on an ongoing period. So we always put this in our planning guides that they should do that. But some people do, some people don't. Sometimes they're not updated very frequently. But the one thing that has seemed to pique people's interest a little bit more are these drought exercises, to try to make planning a little more fun, maybe a little more interesting. And you can do, there's exercises like a tabletop exercise. That's what we worked with the Wallapai tribe. And all we did was take their plan. We came up with some questions and said, okay, here's your conditions right now. You have this much precipitation this year. Your stock ponds are at this level. According to your plan, who should be doing what? And so they're all scrambling through here. And it was just kind of interesting because they had a lot of new people that didn't know they had a plan. They had some managers on there that said, well, according to my plan, I'm supposed to be hauling water. I don't have a truck to do that. I can't do this. I can't follow the plan. So it was really interesting for them to see. They really got into it. One, to learn about their plan. Two, to see maybe some of the shortfalls of their plan are. But that was very cheap. That was just some trip down there for an afternoon just to talk about it. Other people might have more operation simulations. The Potomac River Basin Commission, every year they have their entire watershed modeled. They do drought simulations where they say, okay, if we get this much stream flow, who are we shutting off first, second, third, fourth? And so that's a pretty extensive process they go through, lots of data. Or gaming exercises, also called the drought tournament. And this so far has been used as mainly an educational tool about planning. But you bring a lot of people together, you develop teams, and it's more like a sporting event, and you say, here's your climate situation, your water situation, how would you handle it? And and the teams all get together and say, well, we would do this. They have so much money to work with for certain types of projects. And there's a scoring that's done at the end to see which team came up with the most cost-effective and most water savings and all this strategy. And there's a champion in all this. So it's more of a fun way for educations about drought and about drought planning. But I think you could also tailor that to help evaluate a plan or come up with a plan as well. So anyway, this is just another thing that it's caught on a little bit more because people think it's interesting and fun and educational. But I think it's really beneficial for drought planning. And there's a lot of different resources out there to see what other people have done. Most people, when they develop a plan, there's a lot of borrowing between states. They come up with a good idea. Hey, I would borrow that as well. Don't start from scratch. And so there's a lot of resources out there. We've got on our website a list of all the state drought plans. We've got tribal drought plans, watershed level, local, county, international plans as well. So there's a lot of information already out there on all of this. And so you don't really need to start from scratch. Well, and I know you haven't. At the state level anyway, you've had several revisions of your state plan. But there's a lot of somebody's always coming up with the new ideas. And so there's a lot of information you can tap into. And I think that is it. If there's any questions.